Thank you very much. Thank you to this group for bringing us here and for having this meeting. It's a wonderful meeting. I was talking to, who was I talking to? Ron? Not Ron. Jamie. That this is it for waterfowl meetings in the state. This is the meeting. So if you're interested in waterfowl in the state of Florida, you better be here. You better be here today. So thank you very much to United Waterfowlers and FWC for putting this meeting together and having it a free meeting. We're talking on the way up now. The Wildlife Society meeting, which I'm a member of the Wildlife Society meeting is now like $700 for registration. It's really incredible how expensive these meetings can be. So thank you very much for putting this on. The last sentence there of the bio really was for you. Jamie asked for these bios a couple of days ago, so I gave it to him. And so for the people that know Merritt Island, in the early 1990s, we had lots and lots of ducks. And so, right, lots and lots of ducks. And so we work for the day when we get those birds back. So that was for you, Jamie.
Thank you.
Yes, so a space race, impoundments, and management. So few people in this room have had the pleasure or displeasure of being on the ground with me and in the air and looking at the refuge and talking this talk. And so I apologize because you're going to hear the same thing again, but there's a bunch of people in this room that haven't heard it, and hopefully you think it's interesting. It really does follow nicely with Rockwood's talk, even though Steve and I didn't communicate at all. And hopefully the next talk will really follow up more with this. So whoever put the speakers together, you all did a good job. I'm the wildlife biologist at the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. Stan Howater's here. Stan is the biologist that really focuses on the management of the impoundments and the wetlands. Lane Hamilton is here. She's the project leader of the refuge. So Stan works for me. I work for Lane. We're all here because we do think this is how we manage these impoundments for waterfowl and for waterbird use is important. So I'm going to have some introductory slides here. Hopefully. There we go. For the folks that don't know where we are or the geography of this place, so Orlando is this way, the mouse is over here. This is Highway 50 and 46. This is Titusville here. There's Walmart. Biggest thing in Titusville, right? Okay, so this is the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. It's an overlay refuge on the Kennedy Space Center. The Kennedy Space Center, of course, acquired this land from private landowners through eminent domain in the early 1960s through into the early 1970s. There was actually 2 national wildlife refuges on this property prior to the Kennedy Space Center. There were small islands, not unlike Pelican Island, so for a total acreage of something like 20 acres, when the National Wildlife Refuge System focused on these breeding colonies of birds. So there were 2 refuges there already. When the Space Center came along and purchased this property, which eventually totaled 150,000 acres, there were some people, Alan Cruikshank most famously, that stood up in front of people in Washington, D.C. and said, listen, you've got a perfect opportunity here to have a National Wildlife Refuge on the buffer lands that the Kennedy Space Center doesn't use. And at that time, 35,000 people were working on getting a man on the moon because President Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon. Those people were focused on their one singular mission of getting a man on the moon. They didn't have any time to be dealing with land management. They didn't have any time to be dealing with what was going on the ground around them already. And there already were existing uses: waterfowl hunting, citrus groves, and a fishing industry. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service took that responsibility. And to this day, we still have basically the same written agreement. We manage all the lands not directly used by space. So of the 150,000 acres, there's about 6,000 acres that are used by the space industry for launch pads and roads and that type of thing. The rest of it is a National Wildlife Refuge with all the responsibilities of a National Wildlife Refuge, with all the intent of a National Wildlife Refuge under this written agreement, even though we don't hold fee title to the land. NASA holds fee title to the land. And so, what's the one federal agency in this country with the primary responsibility of wildlife? Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The division of the Fish and Wildlife Service that does land management is, of course, National Wildlife Refuges. National Wildlife Refuges really, got their start, again, quite famously here in Florida at Pelican Island with bird colonies. But really, the refuges gained large amounts of land, large amounts of funding, large amounts of public support in the 1920s, late 1920s and early 1930s, with huge support from duck hunters. Duck hunters were very concerned at that time that North American waterfowl would disappear. They would just be completely gone. That's in the 20s and 30s. And you imagine the difference in pressures then than now. And this was something that was the forefront of national attention. At that time, the President of the United States established proclamation areas where it said you could have no waterfowl hunting in perpetuity in the interest of having waterfowl for the future generations. At that time, dozens and dozens of waterfowl refuges were established, including one that I worked at in North Carolina, Mattamuskeet National Wildlife Refuge, which was established in 1934. Okay, so just a little bit about the size of the place. It's about 30 miles from here to here. It's about 10, 12 miles from here to here. This is the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian River. We're in the northern Indian River Lagoon. This Mosquito Lagoon is within our boundary. There's about 60,000 acres of open water. The rest is, we have about 17,000 acres of scrub, which is xeric soils, high and dry soils, and the rest of it is soil somewhere in between. 26,000 acres of impounded salt marsh at one time, and now reduced a little bit. Talked a little bit about previous land use before we got there. This is the photograph of the Harvard Club. The class of like 1903, I think it was, of the Harvard University got together with their members and built a recreation waterfowl hunting club on the property basically where the shuttle pad B is right now. It was quite a place, and in its heyday was in the teens and 20s. So long history of waterfowl hunting at the site. Communities come in, there's waterfowl hunting, there's fishing industry, there's a number of folks live there, and then this happens, the space race happens, and so this is a very early photograph that was probably actually taken on Cape Canaveral Air Force Station just a little bit to the south. But I love this photograph because of the people standing so close to the rocket. I mean, it's awesome. Even though people at the Space Center do say, light the candle and get it out of here, they actually don't do that anymore. They stand a little farther back. So this is the most recent vehicle, that people know quite famously, the space shuttle. Space shuttle retired a couple of years ago, and so the launch and landing with both here. The space shuttle retired a couple of years ago, and so our landlord, or the folks that own our land, they're really going through changes themselves. They're going through dramatic changes, really. Tearing down infrastructure that is no longer needed, won't be needed in the future, and leasing out other infrastructure. You can get on, the U.S. government websites there. What's the one I'm trying to think of? FedBiz Ops, or yeah, you can go and you could lease out buildings at the Kennedy Space Center if you want to. Some of that land use or some of that leasing that's going on is space related, some of it's not space related. This is Florida Power and Light solar power plant that's taken 100 acres of former citrus grove on the refuge. There are plans to expand some more of this. It's part of our job in the Fish and Wildlife Service to guide these places to have the smallest amount of impact to wildlife and what we do, our mission. So this is a former citrus grove. The citrus industry in this part of the state has been in real trouble for a long time with freezes and with disease. And so it really sort of is a sort of natural progression of change of land use. Okay, so what I'm here to talk about today is really to follow up with what Steve Rockwood said was about waterfowl management and wetland management. So I'm going to talk specifically about our refuge and about our place. Steve talked, really great in general about what you would do with moist soil impoundments and wetland management for waterfowl. This is much more specific. So we can't have this talk without talking about the salt marsh mosquito. So the mosquitoes on this property are quite famous across the state and actually across the world. When the first settlers came to Merritt Island, there are historical accounts of the mosquitoes killing cattle because they would clog the nostrils of cattle. The salt marsh mosquitoes, luckily for us, are not really good disease vectors, but they're prolific breeders and a terrible nuisance. And when they hatch, they have the simultaneous hatching, and they can put out just swarms of mosquitoes. So, back to the space race, they couldn't have that. The contractors wouldn't work out there to put up all this infrastructure with the mosquitoes the way they were. So we're in the period right after World War II, and lots of airplanes around and lots of DDT around. And so Brevard County Mosquito Control entered an agreement with the Space Center and sprayed, and sprayed, and sprayed, and sprayed. And so we have the distinction of being the very first place in the world where it was documented that mosquitoes were resistant to DDT. When you apply DDT or any adulticide over a wetland like this, if you have millions of mosquitoes, you know, the one little genetic mutant that is resistant, of course, he's the only one that breeds. And so very quickly, in a few generations' time, you've got the chemical resistant mosquitoes, which is what they had. So if DDT is not working anymore, what are we going to do? People still want to work out there. And again, this happened in the late 50s, and the people haven't even started really building all the infrastructure yet. So what they did, the Florida Entomology Lab in Vero Beach came up with a really novel idea, doing research right here in Shiloh. Shiloh 5 and Shiloh 3 is where they did the primary research. And for the folks that like to duck hunt at Merritt Island, you know Shiloh 5 and Shiloh 3. It's one of the greatest places to hunt ducks on the refuge. Right, George? Right. Okay. So what they found out is that these mosquitoes have to lay their eggs in mud. So if you remove the mud, you don't have any reproduction. And so the Kennedy Space Center gave Brevard County Mosquito Control $1 million in like 1964 to build earthen levees around salt marsh, and so that those salt marshes could be permanently flooded. And in a testimony to the engineering and to the tenacity of people in that day, they did it all. They did every bit of it. There's about 13 or 14 acres probably of the entire place that they didn't do. Really quite incredible. So about 200 miles of levee surrounding these salt marshes in 76 different impoundments, 76 different units, totaling 26,000 acres. Each of those was constructed typically with one outfall pipe. So if the rain got really high, the water wouldn't go over the levee and destroy the levee. Water would go out an outfall pipe, And if you can't count on rain, and so a series of pumps and a series of interconnected levee pumping systems was designed so that if the water wasn't high enough from rainfall to keep the marsh flooded, they could pump it. And so the combination of rainfall and pumping, you eliminate mud, you eliminate mosquitoes. Okay, I'm spending a long time on this, but it really is the story of our place. So this is a modern picture of these impoundments, of this levee system. So you have a levee. This is the Atlantic Ocean here. This is the beach. This is an impoundment here with a levee around it. This is an impoundment with a levee around it. This is the Mosquito Lagoon. When those impoundments were first constructed, they were just absolutely fantastic for waterfowl. Most of them filled with fresh water, and you had largemouth bass in the impoundments, you had cattail in the impoundments. Things were just fantastic for a number of years, all through the 70s and really into the 80s. And then, like Steve alluded to, when you leave a wetland without disturbance, things change and things happen. And so you get woody vegetation, you get a marsh that is clogged with cattail, and you have things that are, start to decline. And so what we do in most marshes, like Steve said, is introduce a disturbance. And so my slide's out of order here, but anyway. I'm going to get to what disturbances in a minute. It's the same thing Steve told you. Here's a list of the impoundments. This is from our habitat management plan. You can find it on the internet. The red, I'm sorry you can't read this. This is taken out of a book. The red are units that the primary focus, the primary mission, our primary goal is waterfowl and basically deep water wetland birds. So waterfowl, of course, during the wintertime, but those places are also good for wading birds in the summertime. That's everything in the red. In the orange, or this color here, mustard color, it's waterfowl, and then if we have the ability for shorebirds, I believe what that color is. The blue are places for fisheries, And I'm going to get you to another slide. I'm going to get you to the next slide that shows places that have been restored, where the levees have been taken down. So this is basically current land use. A few changes because this is a few years old, but this is basically current land use. Okay, we get back to what Steve talked about. I guess last year he talked about estuarine systems, and I'm sorry I missed that, but this year he talked mostly about freshwater systems. In a freshwater system, like when I worked at Mattamuskeet, or most of the National Wildlife Refuge is actually in the southeast, if you have a marsh you need to do some control on, you need to do some disturbance, this really is the primary tool. Taking a tractor out there that can float on soft soils and pulling a disc, that really does wonders when you have a freshwater system, because you're going to get all those annuals that Steve talked about. At our place, we can't do that. We can't do that for a couple of reasons. The species makeup is completely different. Salt marsh soils are very odd with the chemistry that goes on in salt marsh soils, and we really don't want to turn those soils over like you want to do in a freshwater system. So it leaves us with two primary tools, and that's what these photographs are: water level control and the application of prescribed fire. And I won't go too much into fire because Steve talked about it already. And water level control is sort of a misnomer at our place. We don't have a source of fresh water. So you saw the impoundment there along the ocean. We're surrounded by salt water at every turn. The only fresh water that we get on the entire property is what falls from the sky, our rainfall. This year, thankfully, we're having a wonderful year. This is what Florida is supposed to be. We're having, at least in Titusville, we're having rain almost every afternoon. And the impoundments are wonderful. They're in wonderful condition this year. But we went through an 8 or 9 year period just previous to this year where things were terrible, quite dry. And it was impossible to get fresh water. Okay, so water level control is salt water. We can pump salt water. We got plenty of it around us. We can move it from one place to another. But salt water really is of limited value if you're trying to grow food for ducks. Except for the fact that salt water acts as our tractor. Okay, so here's the scenario. You have a freshwater impoundment that's been fresh for 10 years. It has grown up in cattail, or has grown up in vegetation, and maybe you think it's a little bit too thick, and so you want to do the disturbance. If you're in a freshwater moist soil situation, you would take that tractor out and you disc it up. Well, I told you we can't do that. But we can pump with salt water and get a very similar result. The salt water will remove the cattail like almost instantly. The salt water will open up the system. If we follow that up with burning, which you can see, this is a marsh that has been recently burned. These shrubs in the back are brown from a fire. And then you can see the cattails here in the foreground. This cattail has been severely limited by the application of salt water, and the marsh has been opened up with fire. And so you have a place that at least has the right structure for waterfowl. This would be a great place to land if you're a duck, as far as the structure. So waterfowl, not only need to eat, but they also need to have some place to sit, and they need to have some place where they feel comfortable. It's cover, loafing, feeding, all this stuff. Okay, so that's what we can do, and that's what we do to the best of our ability on about 50 impoundments. We're blessed with having so many different impoundments and so many acres because we can provide shallow water habitat, which shorebirds love and green-winged teal happen to love, and we can provide something that's deeper for other birds. So I'm getting the 5-minute signal here, so I got to go a little bit quicker. The plants that we are concerned about are not what Steve Rockwood talked about, but mostly the submerged aquatics. So widgeon grass and muskgrass. They have different names. People all call them all different names. But if you go out there in the refuge, this is what we see. So on some of the impoundments, especially for those that know the refuge, the east side, the inland side of the wildlife drive, Shallow 5, these are great places for both of these types of vegetation. And they're very good food, have high food value for waterfowl. Not as good as some of the annuals that you'll find in a moist soil situation, but it's what we have and it's what we can grow. Okay. I'm going to talk about challenges here for my last 5 minutes. Is that okay? I'm going to talk about challenges. One of the challenges is we're located right on the coast. And so, unlike TM Goodwin, we have these situations here where storms come along, and there's a levee there that should be 3 feet high, but you can't see it because this is in 2005 during a hurricane. when the water goes over the top of the levee, it causes heck with our levees, and so we have to battle this situation. We deal with a lot of different people, and most times that's a good thing, but all times it actually takes time. The St. Johns River Water Management District, great partner. Brevard County Mosquito Control, great partner. NASA, of course, great partner. FWC, I wish we could partner more. Great partner. But all those things, all these coordination, all this stuff that's coordinating, it takes time. So that's why I just stuck the slide up there. It's very different than a situation where, like at Mattamuskeet, Fish and Wildlife Service owns the land, we do everything, we don't by ourselves. 435 water control structures. Stan knows each one of these intimately. He's the one that goes to these water control structures and maintains them. 435 of these pipes that get visited to manipulate these boards, pull the boards out, put boards down, mow around them, clear the vegetation so you can see them. And then we have these wonderful people that go along and decide they don't like it, so they throw rocks through the impoundment and destroy it. Well, that's a fair amount of work. This culvert has got a bulkhead attached to it. So now you got to clear out the bulkhead, replace the pipe, put it back in. It's time, it's money, it's expensive. We also have, we're the redfish capital of the world in the Mosquito Lagoon. We also have like countless sports writers who continuously put in their articles, fish near culverts with running water. Fish near culverts with running water. Well, that culvert has no water running, but I could make it have water running pretty quickly. And so we have to fight that battle all the time as well. Stan has to fight that battle. Put the boards back in. Just sort of standard stuff. A storm has gone through and taken out a piece of the levee, and so you got to go and get to it. We partnered with the Water Management District to put in these culverts to connect the impoundments to the Mosquito Lagoon and the Indian River in the interest of all things, especially fisheries. High salt marshes are the most productive ecosystems in the world, if you believe what you read in primary literature. So say that again. High salt marshes, irregularly flooded, are the most productive ecosystems in the world in terms of biomass produced, biomass moved in and out of the system. When those things are closed to the Indian River, when they're closed, isolated systems, that biomass is not doing anybody any good. And so in the 90s, we went along and installed most of those culverts. Well, at that time, we installed about 100 of these culverts with flap gates. And it turns out that was a mistake. It was a mistake because these flap gates are on the exterior of the levee. Anytime water is in that's higher than the river, the water flows out. And anytime that water's in, it flows. No, I'm sorry, I got the wrong way. The other way around. Flap gates on the inside. It's led to impoundments that are more salty because when the river is higher than the impoundment, the river flows in. Of course, evaporation happens, the water comes out, leaves the salt behind. Anytime the river's higher, water flows in, and we get impoundments that are continuously more salty. George is very familiar with the beach impoundments in the Mosquito Lagoon. You've seen those beach impoundments change. A lot of that is because of this phenomenon or what's processed. Some of it also is because of the lack of rainfall in the last 10 years. Now, hopefully we're turning that around. We're changing these flap gates out with riser board structures that we can control better as we have money, time, and availability. Okay. I want to talk about a couple of other things that we're doing at the refuge for the enhancement of these wetlands for wildlife. This is one single impoundment. It's called T16. It doesn't look all that big in the photograph, but it's actually about 1,600 acres. This is Peacock's Pocket Road for folks that know the refuge. This is the Indian River. Has a levee all the way around it. This has a water control structure here, it had, and here, and here, and here. The water that came up, that was up in here to the north, when rainfall, was piped to the edge of the wetland and then ran directly into the Indian River. Well, we decided that wasn't a good thing. With Steve Rockwood's help and with the FWC's help, with some funding and some technical expertise, we came ahead and put in ditch blocks along this impoundment, in the canal along the backside of this impoundment, and then installed culverts on the north side, and then blocked the culverts that lead into the Indian River. And so now water flows from the upland, or this hydric hammock area, through the marsh, sort of a natural sheet flow, and then into the Indian River. Simple thing, but probably it's very effective for increasing the value of that wetland. We've taken down lots of levees. Again, we're sort of famous for this at the refuge. We've taken down about 40 miles of levees. I want to explain that a little bit because we've taken a little bit of heat from the waterfowl groups in the past about this. Almost all of it is situations like this. Lots of levee distance, small amount of marsh relative to the levee distance. So this is a levee actually on the Banana River. The levee comes around like this, goes around this marsh. There was no open water here. There was no, primary waterfowl habitat. It's salt marsh that was removed. The connection was severed from the Banana River to the salt marsh. We took the levee, pushed it back in the ditch. Oftentimes there's not enough material to get it completely down, but now there's sheet flow across this levee. The graphic here shows where we've done this, and this is to date. So these are the beach impoundments, for the folks that know those. The long, skinny ones with very little marsh habitat. We've taken those out. This impoundment here, and these impoundments in the security area along the Banana Creek. This impoundment shows this, but there's only a very small part of the levee taken out there. And then the photograph I showed you, I believe, is the impoundments that are right along here in the Banana Creek. So these are places with lots of levee distance with small amount of salt marsh behind it. And that's to connect that fringe salt marsh back to the Indian River Lagoon. So I said a lot. I probably went over my time, but I'm happy to answer questions.